Welcome back to the WAN Manager podcast, the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. So if you heard our episode last week, you heard me and my colleague Elizabeth Thorne going through our key year in review trends for the WAN at our office in DC, which was a lot of fun to be able to record in person. We had too much to cover to get to in just one episode, so we cut it in half, and I'm happy now to present to you the second half of our conversation. Enjoy.
Let's talk about 5G, because I think that was one that, again, like SD-WAN, like SASE, is becoming a thing that people have been talking about for so long, and we're, as analysts, just kind of sitting here waiting for it to happen, right? Mm-hmm. But 2021 was kind of an interesting year with that, right? So there's another branch of TeleGeography over in the UK that kind of looks after more the consumer-oriented stuff, and we're going to use that as kind of a proxy here, right? Because we don't have data on enterprise 5G plans, because again, it's pretty nascent. But what happened in the consumer 5G world over the past year here?
Right. Well, so we have two different figures here, basically. One is from our sort of business broadband report.
Right. Well, that would be
global fixed
focused on the enterprise.
So they found that 5G went from compromising less than 1% of global wireless offerings in 2018 to almost 5% in 2021.
Right.
So still a small percentage of the market, but it's there. It's actually there. And then, as you said, from more of our global comms team, they found that the number of 5G networks across the globe is expected to reach 220 by the end of 2021. So we've definitely seen continued growth in that market. And also, in some of our interviews, we heard some sort of nascent attempts at adding 5G to their network. Didn't always go smoothly,
right?
Because of silicone shortages and things like that were going on for the past year or two.
Right. Yeah. I mean, no matter what industry you're talking about, there was something that had a shortage or couldn't get to you at any rate. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I think in the next year, we might be able to see some of the kind of 5G use cases tested in the multinational enterprise network as these plans become more available. One thing that is will be interesting to see, or an interesting challenge, is sourcing for these sorts of networks. Because I did talk to one person who was interested in adding 5G plans to their network, but they were like, well, we're based in one country. We're based in the UK.
Right.
I can't buy a residential 5G plan in France, for instance,
Right.
So there's this, you'd either need to go through a reseller, which can mark the price up, or you might need to rely on local IT staff, which people may or may not have. So that would be an interesting thing to see how people deal with.
Yeah. Well, just you saying that has me thinking out loud here, which is always dangerous when you're recording it. But I wonder if the aggregators, the Experios of the world, are going to start shifting a little bit toward 5G, because it seems like there's a real opportunity there in terms of it being this, market, kind of like the business broadband market, where, broadband was out there for the past, 25 years or so, mostly as a consumer service. Then they had, you started to see ramp up on hey, we could sell this to businesses. It started out with small businesses or whatever, so again, it may take some time to trickle up to the enterprise, oddly enough, or whatever, because you could see the use case for sort of 5G as your primary or secondary, tertiary kind of connection be for the small business maybe first, right? And that they're more comfortable with the levels of guarantee that come from a sort of consumer adjacent kind of plan, but that if you didn't have to put in all of that work, if you didn't have to have people in every country that, because mobile, even probably more so than broadband, is so country specific because of the licenses, the airwaves or whatever, there are broad, there are ISPs that operate in many countries. There are very few mobile operators that operate in many countries, right? And you're right, like things like SIM cards and getting the equipment at the office and set up. It seems like it'll be probably the pretty rare enterprise that does that themselves. So it's going to need to be their carrier who's sourcing 5G from providers around the world, or an aggregator who's sourcing 5G from providers around the world. But I looked this up while you were talking, and because I thought this was interesting in our global comms, that in Q1 of 2020, we had 32 countries that had any 5G subscribers, and that was up to 68 by Q1 of 2021. Obviously, when we update that Q1 of 2022, I think we'll see quite a few. So there are now, over the period from 2020 to now the end of 2021, you're adding literally hundreds of millions of consumer subscribers to 5G. So I think that definitely means that it's going to trickle up to the business and then to the enterprise market sooner or later here. So we'll finally have something actual to talk about very soon, right? So
definitely.
Yeah. All right, so we're already going a long time, but we'll wrap it up pretty quickly with just the concerns, whether you're getting on the internet through 5G or DIA or broadband. It kind of creates some issues that didn't exist for the enterprise when they were traversing their provider's MPLS network, or their providers, have an NNI with wherever they couldn't get to, and it was their problem. So what have we been thinking about in the sort of middle mile space vis-a-vis that kind of internet performance issue?
Well, exactly as you said, incorporating internet into your network, and especially once you're heading towards the cloud, is a whole different beast, because rather than your traffic basically staying on the network of companies that you've interacted with,
and really going to your network, right? So if we're talking, 5 or 6 years ago, your traffic would be going from your branch office to your headquarters where the data center was. And the public internet or anything like that had nothing to do with it, essentially, right? So
yeah, exactly. So in this case, it's like your first mile that you're trying to get to is actually the cloud provider's network. So it's all about how you're getting there for a lot of people.
Yeah, at a hyperscaler or a neutral colo that has that, and you have no idea how your ISP gets there, right? So yeah,
and so for some people, when they're looking at the middle mile, it's either, well, okay, how can I optimize this through like SD-WAN, or it's how can I, basically kind of bypass this through sourcing transport, like, for example, through network as a service vendors that have become more prevalent, such as Megaport, Packet Fabric, and now Equinix Fabric.
Right.
People are looking at either, sort of building their own kind of transport services using these vendors that are a little more flexible in terms of their billing and procurement, and speed in terms of setting things up. Or they might be looking at companies that provide a private network with, either optimized layer 3 connectivity or like a layer 2. So there's like a whole space basically that was created because the cloud service providers themselves don't actually prioritize networking all that much. And so this kind of niche ecosystem of various providers has developed.
And let me put in a plug too for a couple more alternatives to solve that problem of like what happens to my traffic between when it leaves my office and when it gets to its destination. That, we've talked to some enterprises say, okay, that's one of the reasons I kept MPLS on my network, is that where I have that sort of priority traffic. The reason a lot of folks are moving away from that is because then you're still breaking out internet traffic centrally. And so if you are connecting to your cloud provider over the internet, that creates problems. But there is room there from the carrier perspective for a solution that matches their internet sourcing with their MPLS and sort of more control over it. Or the other alternative that I think some of the folks we talked to are focused on is making sure that within each region they get a tier 1 kind of internet provider, right? So a lot of the middle mile problems go away if your ISP is also the backbone provider for that route, and that leads me to put in a plug for some TeleGeography's way of thinking about this. That we benchmark networks not just by price but by geography, and looking strategically at where you meet your cloud service providers, on-ramp locations, what the cloud regions are, and where you have your data centers in colo neutral facilities and things like that. So that understanding that geography, you can sort of avoid some of these problems, even before you get to the benefits of using one of these kind of alternative providers, network as a service or over the top. So there are a variety of ways of thinking about that. But I think the thing for sort of year in review of 21 to focus on is that, leaving MPLS for at least some of your traffic is probably a very sensible thing to do in terms of cost and performance for some things, but that it may also create other problems that you need to make sure you're getting ahead of,
Right, exactly, because the traffic moving over the internet might be routing pretty inefficiently, and it's also hard to get visibility on where exactly it's going before it gets to its final destination.
Yes, exactly. And the thing that always gets me, and that we've heard several enterprises say this, that there's kind of two aspects of this, that you don't have the same clout with a local ISP as you do with a carrier that you're giving hundreds of millions of dollars to, right? And that even if you did, right, that ISP may have no control over what ultimately, because the traffic leaves your office on your ISP's network. They have an IX, in the same metro even, and from there that it's no longer their problem, right? So I think that understanding that landscape, it doesn't dictate sort of how you go about your sourcing, because there's a lot of reasons to do your sourcing in various ways, but it does kind of dictate that the way that you go about your sourcing may cause you to think about some other solutions that you may need to pick up, and all the trade-offs there. Local ISP is going to be very cost effective, but then maybe you need to add on an over-the-top service like Teridian or Alkira or something like that to manage your traffic performance. And that still may make sense, but it makes the WAN manager, IT infrastructure manager's sourcing decisions kind of more complicated on that, So.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Alkira. That kind of plays into another aspect of the kind of cloud environment that is pretty rapidly developing, which is both multi-cloud and then kind of cloud-to-cloud networking, which are two different similar elements that kind of get confused under the multi-cloud label at times.
Right. Like when we say multi-cloud, we mean you are an enterprise who has more than one infrastructure platform as a service provider, whereas cloud to cloud means...
Right. Cloud to cloud is actually connecting your disparate cloud environments together, which is not something that is necessarily a native capability for these different...
the incentives aren't exactly there for them.
Exactly, which again is why there's these various vendors that have appeared, such as Alkira. Aviatrix is another one where they specialize in doing like in the cloud routing, which is just a very new space and something that I'm personally still learning about. But I think it'll become even more relevant as companies continue to move their workspaces into the cloud, and the cloud kind of becomes the center of the network with everyone just trying to reach it, which also is another kind of new thing, which is that some CSPs are starting to provide some backbone transport services for their own networks, such as the Azure Virtual WAN. AWS just announced one. I think it's called Cloud WAN.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
And I haven't necessarily talk to anyone who's actually adopted this, but it is an interesting proposition of just, your stuff's it's basically like if you're, all of your important workspaces are already here, just use our backbone
just
to connect all of them
instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The only issue, I think the only hesitation with that might be a little too much vendor lock-in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it just contributes to this idea that we've been wrestling for the last few years of like, if we're covering the WAN, what is the WAN? and does that dissolve into sort of, the whole word cloud has always in the network space been a representation of things that you're just not focused on at this moment in time, right? There's still wires and computers that someone owns, right? And so it's really just a changing of like whose wires are you going over and what is the situation for that. But the key thing for us, I think, and for the listeners really is, what does it cost and how do you figure out how those costs are billed and all of that? And so I think that's like the thing that I really want to look out for in 2022. All these network as a service models, or even directly from the CSP kind of those are essentially network as a service models, right? Or networks as a service models coming from startup providers or whatever. The key question in them is, how do you engage with them and what does it mean, right? And they're still being rolled out. They're still really not serving actual customers for the most part. I mean, it's out there. And
that's the thing. A lot of this like network as a service, middle mile oriented stuff, it's very nascent to the point where like we'll get briefings and they'll be like, oh yeah, this is going to be out in like a year.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So that's the thing I'm really looking out for in 2022 is how does this actually go to market in terms of what kind of contract are enterprises going to sign and with whom over the next few years for these kinds of services, and does that even make the other contracts they're signing go away, or is it in conjunction with that? And
I mean, there's always also the possibility, because a lot of these new companies are startups, that they might, submit an R&D for the telcos, and they might get acquired. And this
who buys them?
Yeah, right? That's become part of your carrier.
Yeah, I mean, which it would have been surprising if we had made guesses about that in the SD-WAN space of like, okay, so a security vendor is going to buy an SD-WAN provider, right? So I think that's a great point. Another thing to kind of look out for as we're thinking about 2022. Of these startups are probably, let's face it, in a lot of cases designed from the ground up to be purchased by a large entity. And is that going to be MSPs, carriers, vendors, equipment vendors, maybe? And that'll be interesting. Yeah, awesome. But yeah, you know what? This is great fun, Lizzie. Thank you. I'm sure we'll do this again next year. And, I want to hear from listeners, like what was the most important thing to you guys this year. So please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or Lizzie, you're on LinkedIn as well. And let us know what's going on there, or, via, you can read our blogs at blog.telegeography.com and get in touch with us through the contact info there. Or many of you listening are no doubt on the WAN forum, where you can get on the forum itself, powered by Circle, right? It's kind of a social media sort of thing. So feel free to pop in there and tell us what you thought the most important things are. I think we'll try to distill this conversation into an analysis piece in the members only section of the forum as well, so we can hopefully hear from some of you on that. And with that, Lizzie, I think we're getting close to holiday party time. Yeah. All right. Let's go get some sushi and drinks and stuff. All right. Thanks.
Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day.